Welcome to the Interoperability Roundtable. This is an open forum fostering conversations around interoperability. And I'm Jake Tunney, product manager at LeapOrbit, and I'll be your MC today. And we are joined by hosts David Finney and Mrinal Baskher, co-founders of LeapOrbit, who are currently working on improving access and accuracy of of provider data with Convergent, which is a provider directory API as a service that also assists plans to comply with the CMS interoperability rule. And today we are joined by Morgan Templar, who is the VP of Data Management at Highmark Health. And thanks so much for joining us, Morgan. Morgan is recognized as a high integrity, energetic leader with excellent strategic vision, collaborative approach, and the vision to actualize strategic goals in complex environments. She is also the best-selling author of Get Governed, Building World-Class Data Governance Programs. So just before we jump in, our goal with this conversation, as I mentioned, is to make it a collaborative environment where we're answering questions and fielding comments from the audience. So if you have any comments or questions, please enter it in the chat. And if you'd like, please mention that you might like to be added as a panelist, and we just might add you. So is everybody ready to get started?
Sure.
Absolutely. Let's go.
Okay. All right. So we have a list of topics here to get the conversation started. And the first one that I think there's probably a lot to unpack here, but why is the CMS interoperability rule that, I think most folks on this call probably are aware of at this point. It's been talked about a lot, but why is it just not just a requirement?
Well, I think that the biggest thing about it is that it really opens a door. This is the first time in healthcare, particularly, that we have been expected to make healthcare data available on any app, anytime, any third-party application that you want to go to the Apple Store or the Google Play Store and download an app and say, I want to be able to access my financial data or manage my health or manage my diabetes. And we now as healthcare organizations are required to provide that information out. So that's new. So that kind of feels very uncomfortable for those of us in healthcare who've been tightly bound by HIPAA. But even though it is only applicable today to federal products, and I'll just leave it at that because it's a short list, but of specific federal requirements. But as people, especially those of us who have elderly parents who may give us authorization to access their information online with an app that I choose, as we begin to get used to pulling data and being able to see data in any application, it's already being asked for to be given to commercial plans and commercial customers and individuals, because it's opening a brand new door. All of a sudden, this data that's been very controlled, secured, and held is now available. And so we've had to build it out for anyone to get their data, but I think the appetite is there for everyone to be able to get their data in that way.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think I've been sort of shocked in a pleasant way how quickly the adoption of FHIR is spurring innovation. And I think sort of the combination of FHIR and patient empowerment, these are really the ingredients for a dramatic shift in the way that health data sort of moves across the economy and the ecosystem. We're working on projects with big Fortune 500 companies and disability insurers, life insurers. All of them are starting to look at how to use sort of patient-mediated or consumer-mediated exchange to do things that just weren't possible even 6 months ago. I think the other point I'd make, and Mrinal, you have a lot of thoughts on this too, is I think it would be a mistake to see the interoperability rule as one-off regulation. It's not just a bunch of deadlines that affected organizations need to check the box on. This is the beginning of a process. And if you don't plan with that in mind, you're going to find yourself with a lot of sort of throwaway work and duplicative effort down the road as these expectations continue to ratchet up.
Yeah, absolutely agree, David and Morgan. The way, you know, as an innovator in healthcare data, the way I think about this is, if you have ever tried to, you know, work with an EHR system, for example, and say, hey, you know, we can add this care coordination thing in there, or we can add a new way of risk stratifying patients, or figure out a new clinical decision support model, and you wanted to do that in Epic or Cerner or any of the EHR systems, and we struggled, right? All these years we have struggled to bring innovation because it was so hard to integrate, you know, with data, but also just user interface integration was so hard. FHIR is really changing the paradigm. The integration paradigm is lightweight. It can be very, you know, easy with Smart on FHIR and other integration, you know, new age integration methods. But it also allows for, you know, if you have looked at CDS hooks, for example, ability for an EHR to say, hey, I got this patient, there's this data, only if this patient is high risk for, let's say, one thing or another, that a thing will pop up in the doctor's, you know, user interface, that they will be able to use it. Those kind of workflows were just not possible before. And it's possible not just because of the Smart on FHIR user interface integration, but also because of the APIs that the EHR vendors are making available. So you can grab whatever, you know, little pieces of data that might be relevant for you. And if you look back and say, you know, could we not do this with CCDA? I mean, these were blunt tools, really, you know, big blobs of documents, and they were not great for these workflow integrations that are now possible. And whether you like it or not, we had a problem of data silos, but what we'll have in a couple of years here, maybe sooner, will be a data deluge problem. And we'll talk about that later in this thing as well. And a lot of innovation will be possible. So if you're thinking about this as a check the box, you know, let's just meet this requirement, and that might be okay for in the interim if you're really struggling. But really, we all need to look at it strategically in our organizations and say, how can we really make this a pivot to be an innovation-centric organization, empower others, third-party applications as well, and in ways to also add to our top line of revenue growth, because a lot of this data was just not possible before to make work, but now you could use it and allow patients to have access to it.
If I could just kind of pivot off that just a little bit, I mean, I think about what you said, there are a couple of perspectives. There's the internal interoperability as well, where we are between our platforms, between our systems, utilizing APIs more and more internally as well. As we look at then turning those APIs out externally, it's really a tremendous growth of the access of data. Just as you said, it's breaking through the silos, it's making data liquid, and it is truly making it available for us to share it out and make it available for decision making. The clinical decision making is a huge use case for interoperability. As we look at you know, all of the data that we collect, and it used to just be a bunch of scanned documents. We're now having to actually digitize that and actually get that information out into you know, a way that can be shared. From a provider perspective, the EHRs and the HL7 standards have been around a long time. From the payer perspective, there really hasn't been a standard that we utilized to share, and FHIR has really opened up that bridge between the two worlds, and requiring us to actually do that bridge, actually build that bridge and cross it. I think FHIR is, just as you said, it's a tremendous tool. So kind of onto your the second topic, I wanted to kind of pivot off of your statement. The one thing that I think in FHIR is, while it is just quickly becoming the standard, there is more than one implementation guide. There's more than one way to actually install FHIR and how to use it. And it doesn't cover all of the data that we need, even for the CMS ONC requirements. And so everyone is writing some kind of extension library. And so those extension libraries, along with the implementation guides, are really what we're, I think, as an industry and as a IT type providers, we really need to think about how we can standardize those extensions. I know that both Karen and DaVinci have done a really good job at providing implementation guides, but US CDI and US Core are both working on those additional extensions to really be able to cover the full medical history, not just what's on the EOB, not just what's on the EHR, but really to be able to tie all that together.
I absolutely agree. And if I can add there, so before there was FHIR, there was HL7 V2 and V3, and if you look at the IHE standards, these were sort of meta standards built on top of the existing standards to facilitate specific use cases, and they were extremely critical for the broader adoption of these standards. So integrating the healthcare enterprise IHE set of standards that empowered the NHIN and WHIN and other exchanges, including eHealth Exchange and Commonwealth, those kind of things. With FHIR, as Morgan said, the DaVinci work group is extremely important and critical for the payer related use cases, and they've been instrumental in pushing this. You look at these regulations that are coming, that they're all sort of with DaVinci work in mind. But absolutely agree. I mean, thinking about how payers were either on their own volition or sometimes just not enough impetus for it, payers were not as in the interoperability business as much as all the other healthcare providers were. And so with the claims data and with some of these regulations, payers are also realizing how important it is to make this data available, but how it can be a source of strength and innovation for the payers themselves. So it's quite fascinating to see that, and I agree, Morgan, that with the standard still being quite new, there's so much work going on. I mean, if you look at the prior versions, I mean, sometimes backward compatibility was not even being addressed. So you have some normative sections of FHIR, HL7 FHIR, and there's some that are not. So don't need to be backward compatible. So there are some versions that were not. And so as you're going to the next version, suddenly the old version is not adhered to anymore. And that's okay with newer standards, because just part and parcel of it. But I think it's getting better. R4 onwards, a lot of things are normative. So I think they'll all be backward compatible, and it's just part of maturity cycle, I guess. So that will definitely happen. I think a lot of tools and technology, and if you look at all the cloud vendors, like everybody has thrown their lot behind FHIR, and I think tooling is a very important part of the industry's adoption. And so like if you think about the SOAP services and IHE based stuff, that there were lots of tools for those, and so it was easier to develop on those. But now FHIR is becoming the standard, and And frankly, FHIR is much closer to the industry way of doing things across other industries as well. So it's much easier to adapt to those, and other tools like API gateways and things that empower you to actually do those things more easily in secure ways. They're all coming together. API orchestration is another thing, right? I mean, you look at these interface engines that are still serving most of the healthcare transactions. They have existed for a very long time. These API orchestration engines are relatively new, and the native support for HL7 FHIR isn't quite there yet. So there's a fair bit of work to do there. But knowing that the IBMs and Amazon, Microsoft, Googles of the world have thrown their lot behind it and they're building FHIR servers and tools and technologies to support all of that is quite encouraging.
And looks like we have two questions from our attendees, and they're both very topical and somewhat related. So I'm going to start with the first one from Dan Chase. And he says, to David and Mrinal's point about building this for the future of the interoperability rule, how can we best seek solutions to the CMS interoperability rule phase 1 if we are not aware of the end goal and future requirements of interoperability? We are seeking the best solution to the long-term direction, but we're not made aware of the long-term direction.
I think the reference in the regulations to Da Vinci implementation guides is our best clue for what the future looks like. So CMS has really tied itself to Da Vinci and Karen, I think, as the forward thinkers about how FHIR can be adopted in sort of a phased and ever expanding way. And so I think if you kind of look at what the interoperability rule does, and I'll just take provider directory is a good example because it's really simple. Plans are required to support a FHIR request for a practitioner resource, which is just one resource in the PDEX implementation guide. But if you kind of work your way through the Da Vinci PDEX implementation guide, you can see that the way that FHIR can render all of the attributes of a provider and the relationships between practitioners and organizations and health plans and lines of business and all of those things is extremely complex. And so we're kind of in like, kindergarten or first grade of Da Vinci right now with what the rule does. And I think it's a reasonable expectation that we're going to see CMS sort of gradually raise the stakes and say, this is the wave of the future, and these groups are leading the charge, and we're going to follow close behind. By the way, you can also see, the big commercials that have the R&D budgets to do this are already kind of headed in this direction. So if you look at the developer portals that an Aetna or United have out there, that they're already starting to do more with FHIR than just what's narrowly expected in the interoperability rule.
Yeah, I would say that we're doing the same. We're looking at it. I have 2 FHIR servers in my stack right now. One with one implementation guide, Karen, and one with the Da Vinci implementation guide. Again, it's tough to say where CMS is going to take us, but I do think there are clues, and I think these implementation guides do help us get there. The huge amount of support around both Da Vinci and Karen from a lot of the big players in healthcare, both payer and provider, really do give us, I think, a good guideline. I think when you look at the US CDI, what is that? US Clinical Data.
Or interoperability.
Interoperability, that's right. It's like, why can't I remember the interoperability standard? There are a lot of things that we specifically have to put endpoints for, but if you think about healthcare in general, and you start reading through US CDI guidelines, there are many additional things that I could just take pen and paper and just like write the next 4 things next to it. And these are going to be the next 4 and the next 4 and the next 4, because it is going to grow and it is becoming the standard. Internally as well as externally, we're building off of FHIR, which we've never done before. I mean, this is when I say never, I mean, we've been doing it for about a year now. We've been transitioning to FHIR, and it makes a big difference, really, to know that you're having a standard model, even internally, as we work with vendors, as we work with the payer to provider communication. It's a lot easier utilizing FHIR APIs than having to build flat files and, you know, try to explain what all that means and map everything. A lot of that mapping is done for us. A lot of that understanding is already available without having to do a translation layer. So I think that as we think about where this is going and how do we operationalize this for scale and for being future-proof, it really is directed at making things aligned to these larger standards, staying aligned with them, understanding where they're going, following them. You know, it's an ever-changing landscape, but we have a good foundation.
Yeah, I agree. Just one thing to add there, as you were talking about, you know, these lightweight, more granular, you know, FHIR APIs based on resources. But you know, there's another thing that's quite a bit of interest to us, which is bulk FHIR. Ability to really for the first time in healthcare, ability to say, you know, this is what my search is. Get me all the data for that search, and it could be, you know, a fair bit of data, but there's now a standard to download things. And you know, if you look at the provider directory piece of the interoperability rule, they're essentially saying you have to enable bulk FHIR for your provider directory. That means that they are encouraging companies to download, you know, bulk data from these places and make, you know, do analytics and slice and dice that data and make it available in different ways. So, you know, when I was talking about data deluge problem, there'll be a new generation of companies that will, you know, mine and harvest that data and make it available to different parties. And we are already doing that at Leap. But it's going to be really interesting and important for the industry because you know, efficiency of scale. You know, if you are mastering and harvesting this kind of data and make it available at scale, you can really bring down the cost on some of these things that used to be so expensive to buy from the market.
Great. And if no one else has anything to add on that, we do have a second question. I think it is relevant to this as well. And this comes from Anirban. And the question is, since CMS has not mandated FHIR for payer-to-payer exchange, Morgan, this might be directed more at you. What is Highmark's perspective on it? Will you follow FHIR or allow non-FHIR? I think if industry goes down the SFTP non-FHIR process, it would defeat the intent of interoperability.
We are planning to go payer-to-payer in FHIR. There's just no question about it. There's no reason to. We've already put all this data available, all the clinical data, all the, you know, the EOB data, the claims data, the pharmacy data. It's all available now in FHIR, and we're not going to go back. We're going to move forward in FHIR. So as interoperability 2.0, as we call it, which is the payer-to-payer exchange, we will absolutely be utilizing FHIR.
Yeah, makes total sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to our next topic. So we started to unpack this a bit, but FHIR is new, and there are some limitations around it. Let's dive into that a little bit more. Morgan, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah. I think as we kind of touched on a little bit ago, we have to extend our FHIR implementation guide. we have data that's required under the CMSO and C interoperability that goes beyond the implementation guide. There isn't a way to deliver some of that information. And so, we take our best guess. We try to follow patterns. Patterns being really important. There is a specific. So I'm initially a music major, so I'll say there is a cadence and a harmony to how the FHIR standard is developed. And if you look at that cadence and that harmony and that structure and that beat and that pattern, you can continue to build those extensions out in a way that we believe will be compatible in the future. So I think there's definitely opportunity for improvement, but I also think there's a pattern to follow.
I think this is a perennial problem when standards start to take off, right? The bodies that are promulgating the standards do their best to sort of run out in front of the industry, but in a situation like this where the adoption of FHIR has just exploded, it's been really difficult. That being said, I think HL7 and the other folks that are working on this have learned from the past, and they're doing a pretty okay job. If anyone wants to be reminded how bad this could be, look at HL7 V2 and Loink, and I know we spent a lot of time early in the
V3 actually.
Well, V3 too. But what I was going to say is we spent a lot of time looking at lab data early in the COVID pandemic to try to make sense of testing and aggregate testing to regional and county level statistics. And the amount of variability in lab data was not surprising to anyone, but this is a problem that's 15, 20 years old that just never got cleaned up. And I don't think anyone ever wants to be there again as we start to migrate towards a FHIR-centric world.
Yeah, agree. And I touched upon some of the lack of backward compatibility things. So there's some challenges with new standards as usual. The other part of this whole thing around how do we keep it extensible? With every standard, you are split between being as clear as possible, as prescriptive as possible, but also being as flexible as possible. And those things are sort of butt heads with each other, and doesn't quite work always. But it's a process. It takes time. And one of the things I would say to Morgan and team is, as you're working through it and you're finding these things and saying, hey, here's another extension, chances are all payers or folks that are doing similar work are running into exactly the same thing. So can this be sort of submitted back to the body and say, hey, guess what, we did this, this might be helpful. And then they might come back with saying, oh, how about we combine 4 of these and make into something, right? And they may not be exactly the same, but very similar to whatever you propose, right? So I think the standards bodies need help from the industry, and it's like HL7 FHIR has been one of the biggest industry collaborations in the history of healthcare. So I feel really positive that we'll be in a really, really good place, not too distant a future.
I completely agree with that. I've always said we just need to standardize data. We need to stop having, everyone has their own version, their own data model, their own way of looking at it. In the end, the data is the data. It's not different if I'm in Pittsburgh or if I'm in San Jose. It's still the same data. And so there's no reason we can't share it. I think that I would kind of in counterpoint to what you said just a moment ago about the standards board. So about Da Vinci and Karen, they've been tremendous collaborative ventures, and certainly have really helped set the standard. But I don't want to be negative in any way, but it's unfortunate, I guess, that they are closed now. They're not accepting feedback and openness from everyone. There is if you didn't get in time, you're not part of Karen, you're not part of DaVinci, and you have to either join via a partner, or you have to, you can submit things, but you're not really a voice at the table. And I do think that there needs to be more of an open industry forum where it's a little bit more extensible, I guess. And I will say that there are a few areas where groups and organizations are doing that. If you're working with any of the big consultant firms, those consultancies will often have a way into one of either DaVinci or Karen. And the same thing with AHIP. AHIP has a voice there as well. Sure. And so they have an open forum on interoperability. And so there is a way to get our voice heard, but I think that it is a little bit challenging that they're closed systems at the moment.
Sure. No, I hear you, and I'll do my best to pass on that that feedback. I did hear about some of that at some point, but I was hoping that there are venues to still work through that.
Well, and I would say that there are. I mean, like I said, I participate on an AHIP board, as do some of my counterparts at Highmark, to be able to give our voice. And it is, building these extensions really is something that we'll have to do until the standards change. It's not uncommon for us to be ahead of the standard. No standard can anticipate everything, and interoperability really is here to stay. I expect the federal standards to continually grow until they encompass pretty much the entire patient experience and the member experience. And as we look at that, what does that mean for us as we think about what we can also utilize interoperability for? There are a lot of amazing things that we'll be doing with the ability to get our data, our own data out of our own systems via API, as well as to pull through, our pharmacy vendors and our labs, and all that data being able to flow through our orchestration layers, being able to, have access to it even for our own needs, obviously according to the consent and preference of the member or patient. And those are really big, serious concerns, as well as the legality of use of data and data ethics. So I might be pivoting our subject to
I'll get. What's next, Jake?
Okay, massive data sets. So this is where we can get into discussing scalability and flexibility, also protection against bad actors, and gateway security protocols.
So that is really, that's, I think, been the biggest challenge. We've got about 10 million members on our platform for over several blues. And we went down the path initially of a Java facade, of being able to pull the data out with Java and having a facade layer over our data sets and being able to deliver it out. We were advised early by a couple of different vendors that if you went over about 400,000 people in that data set, that the facade layer was going to be unstable. And we proved that out very quickly, and had to actually move our data into FHIR repositories. And so that massive migration and movement, I think, Mrinal, as you mentioned about data deluge, the ability to actually, pull that out and deliver it, we have to have it in a place where it's able to be pulled from.
Yes.
So moving it into these FHIR repositories has actually been the long pull in the tent, and the one we didn't anticipate, because we understand our data, we knew how to map it, but actually creating physical structure to hold your data has been a really big effort. The scalability and the flexibility of that that's a limiting factor, actually. I would love it if someone had a really neat, nifty plugin that we could just drop in on top of our data warehouse and say, okay, plug it in, and it's got everything. But in reality, we've had to translate everything into FHIR and move it into our own FHIR repositories to make it available.
And I'll add to that, with my own experience in the health information exchange market, where about 3.5 years ago, we got into the business of, hey, now that we have all this data and we have portals and such, now we really need to liberate this data by providing APIs to partners and providers and such. And I tell you that we went through exactly the same process, right? You start with saying, oh, we already have our data structures. We just map it to FHIR and put a facade on top and make it available through APIs. Guess what? Doesn't. The backend couldn't handle it, wasn't designed for it, and all of that. So then you go to, okay, so how do we do this? And there are many layers of things that you have to think about. I mean, obviously there is security, gateway, and things like that. It's like if you have one bad actor, they can pull the whole service down. So do you have throttling of number of requests that can be made, per hour, per day, per month, whatever, right? And then you have, what kind of security do you put in? Do they have ability to call with just a security certificate or a token? Or do you go old school and say, simple ID password? Probably not good for API calls, right? So all these things that you have to think through, and you shouldn't have to build that, right? That's why you have the API gateway products. And the other part of this is the ability to scale on demand. And the problem with APIs is that you don't know when it's going to be called quite frequently, in a burst of 10 seconds. we ran into this today with some of our stuff, or that you may not have too much traffic for long durations of time, and then suddenly big amount of traffic. And how do you quickly and flexibly scale with that? And so I think moving some of your components to the cloud and ability to have that, only scale it when there's a need, and then pull it down when you don't, has to be an important part of your thinking. So you're not paying big money for infrastructure that doesn't get used for long durations. So there are a lot of things there. Bulk FHIR, presents another challenge for a lot of folks. Like, oh, okay, so now we gotta export all our data and make it available. Have you designed your systems for that kind of thing, right? I mean, a lot of systems are designed for transactions, but not great for bulk export. And so it's like there are lots of heads to this monster, and you strategically have to think about the different layers of architecture.
I think the thing that surprised me the most was the difficulty of the orchestration.
Yeah.
We do APIs all the time between our vendors, between our clients. And it's not like we don't know how to put data through an API gateway. So we didn't really expect it was going to be as much of a challenge, but a call comes in, and literally, because we are so accustomed to, within the blink of an eye, I've hit send, I want my data. Yeah. And that has to go sometimes to 3 or 4 different companies through their gateways to pull all the data and collect what I've asked for, and then repackage it up and deliver it to me all through one API that I called on my phone. And I expect that, like, I'll wait for a second for a spin, right, but I'm not going to wait for 10 minutes. So that orchestration, I think, was the thing that really took us more by surprise than anything. And not that we aren't able to do it, we're certainly doing it, but we already had a gateway, we already used APIs. Why would that be so hard? It's proving to be a very it's a Goliath of a problem, truly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially if you have to orchestrate across parties that you don't have control over their responsiveness, right? So it becomes harder, and obviously there are other sort of design patterns that you can use. Get the query, let the people know that you receive their query, and you can make the data available when it's available. national networks have similar kind of challenges on collecting data from thousands of nodes. And there's then some design patterns, not all practical for different use cases, but definitely for some use cases.
I think the protection against bad actors topic is also another really important component of it. There are standards that prohibit us from blocking data in the interoperability OSC standards, and that is challenging when you have to potentially protect against bad actors, those who might, overwhelm your system intentionally, or, interfere with your ability to deliver by creating, a bunch of dummy requests. And, that's something that we've really had to take very seriously as we've looked at our cybersecurity around it, our authorization, our tokenization, how we, measure and monitor the usage in the poll. And to be fair, as we're thinking about moving this beyond CMS and into the commercial market, not just protection against bad actors, but the monetization of the data that we have available is actually going to be a really important component that we think about as well. That wasn't on our list of things to talk about, but it really just kind of flows out. It's the same type of monitoring and understanding and analytic around your data and who's using it, what they're using it for, and how often they're calling and how much data they're pulling. We have to be able to protect against that and protect our members and our patients' data. But that same structure is available now as a new use case of being able to monetize commercially.
Morgan,
yeah. Go ahead.
Morgan, how are you at Highmark thinking about third-party applications, patient member authorized applications? Have you kind of created a framework for how you'll decide which ones get a thumbs up and which ones get a thumbs down?
There's more than one answer there, because we are an integrated system. So we have a provider side and a payer side. And on the provider side, there's more ability to vet out the apps and authenticate them. That's not the right word, but anyway, put them on the good list, yeah, as opposed to the naughty list. So yes,
authorize, yeah,
authorized. Thank you. Yeah, so we have more ability there to be able to say you're authenticated and you're part of our authorized list. On the payer side, there's a little bit less flexibility on that, and so we do a token OAuth process with those vendors, but we also with those apps, but we also have a very significant monitoring around those and what happens with the data. Are there any complaints? All of those kinds of things, because some of it we won't know about. There's a lot of legal, I'll say, that goes into it, because the terms and conditions of use in the application of releasing your data, the member has to give us that permission. And so writing out those terms and conditions, making sure that that's all agreed to by the member, protects us a little bit. But more than that, we want to make sure that we're protecting that data. And so it's ask me in a year.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things with patient access. I mean, with great power comes great responsibility, and I think, at some point our society is going to wake up and realize, like, all of this data, when the patient clicks the button, has been liberated from HIPAA and everything that goes with HIPAA, and it's going to be the Wild West, kind of outside of the gates.
It really is. It's I had a conversation with someone just earlier this week. I read every one of those privacy statements. I never click the I accept until I have read it all. And if it takes me through 7 different attachments, I read them all, because I'm old school that way. And I want to make sure that I know where my data is going. And if I'm giving permission to use my data, I know what it's for, because data is an asset. But that's in part because I understand what an asset it is. I think, my kids never read any of that. They scroll to the bottom, click, and they're good because they want the functionality. And it doesn't bother them that their data is going to go all over. And so I think, those of us who kind of, I would say, grew up in a HIPAA world where we learned in business that everything is to be protected and nothing is to be released. And PHI is it's your precious pearls. You don't ever show them before anyone. It's all, as you said, Wild West. It's just, if you clicked accept and you authenticated and said yes, all right.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I'm not picking on, big technology companies necessarily, but, the same companies that have the almost infinite financial resources and engineering resources and intellectual resources to think of really, really cool and powerful things that could be done with this data if consumers choose to give it to them, are the same ones that I think we're having a national conversation about how they exploit people's personal data for for business reasons that the people don't necessarily appreciate. So
I will cite this, that Dan Power from State Street Bank said, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product.
For sure.
Yeah,
and I think healthcare is not quite prepared for the implications of that with with the data that we're used to protecting so carefully.
Yes, I agree.
All right, it doesn't look like we have any other questions from the audience. We'll maybe give up just in time. Just a new question popped up. This is from Hemant. And the question is, hi, Morgan, with the COVID-19 vaccine rollout and all of us now having to carry our vaccine cards to prove we have our vaccinations, what are your thoughts on how interoperability will help digitize this for us so we are able to carry a digital vaccine card that is recognized internationally?
This is an interesting question.
It's a very interesting question. That opens up so many things. I don't know if I can answer that. I honestly don't know if I can answer it because honestly, I think that the standards around the digital ID for vaccination for COVID they vary so greatly, country to country, even state to state, on what that means. In all honesty, I had COVID, so I'm not getting the vaccine because I've had it. And so I should be as immune as anyone with the vaccine, but I won't have a card. So, what is the implication for those like me who I won't ever have that card? So I don't know that I can answer that question.
Yeah, I'm not qualified to answer that question either, but one thing as a technologist that comes to my mind is some sort of a blockchain solution. So, you can absolutely, verify that a card is good when it's presented. That's all.
I'm only qualified to speculate on this topic, and I'm more than happy to do that. I could see, first of all, I know that there are private companies that are working on digital vaccine passports or whatever you want to call them. I could see something emerging as a standard domestically here in the US that would be embraced by the airline industry and sort of other, the restaurant industry and things like that. I think internationally is a totally different question. For those of us who have lived, in the developing world and are used to having our yellow fever CDC immunization card, like I think probably my COVID vaccination card is going to go right next to that one. And if you're going somewhere where you might need it, you're going to pull it out of your pocket, or it's going to be in your passport.
That's a tough question.
Okay. So I think our questions are coming to a close here. I don't have any more topics. So do we feel like this is a good place to wrap it up?
Yeah, sure.
I think so. I was kind of reading down through my notes as well as what we talked about. I think, I would say in closing, I think, interoperability is here to stay. It's here that it's and so is FHIR. And so as we we'll still continue to have, REST API and other ways of getting data, but the FHIR standards will continue to grow. And I think that's a really big positive move in healthcare as we look at interoperability, 3.0 and 3.x and et cetera. So yeah, we all need to be ready, and we all need to be flexible and ready to scale.
Great. I think that's a great place to end it.
Morgan, thank you so much for joining us and taking your lunch hour to hang out and have this conversation. It's been a lot of fun. I hope we can do it again.
Thanks. It's been a blast, guys. Appreciate it. I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Yep, you too. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.